All right. Now welcome on Ken Light. Ken, really excited to talk to you. Me and my friend Saeed, a fellow photographer, we saw you at the DNC last week, and we saw you in the background of the CNN broadcast. And we're like, we see this guy shooting. I think you're shooting a Mamiya 6, right?
Yes, Mamiya 6 film
And
camera.
we're like, who is this guy shooting a Mamiya 6 at the DNC? And with the help of my friend, fellow photographer Sophie Park, who was out there photographing for the Wall Street Journal, she was able to connect and figure out who you were. And now I've been doing the deep dive into your work, man, and really excited to talk to you about your career and all your photography. But I guess to start off, like, how was it photographing the DNC last week, and what was kind of your approach to photographing out there?
So it was very mixed, very, very mixed. My experience, I think, like a lot of other photographers, were the DNC floor people were not very friendly to us, um, constantly telling us, take your shot and move along.
Mhm.
And I don't know if you experienced the floor being closed down for what was an hour and a half, and not allowing any media to come in.
I saw that on your LinkedIn. You made a
Yeah.
post, and it was like a guy putting his security guy putting his hand right in front of your camera.
Yep.
And I mean, you've been covering politics for years and been to a lot of conventions. I think I saw Contact Press Images had a post about you. I think your first one was like in 1972.
Yeah.
Um, is how different is it since you first started covering politics to now? Is that just kind of commonplace with the access, or is it much different now in this I guess landscape?
I think the landscape has completely changed, and I think that it was much easier to have access, much easier to get closer to people, less scrums around politicians. You know, the politicians all have their minders with them. You know, they're much more conscious of the media world. There's this whole new group of creators that we saw broadly at the DNC that kind of have just bypassed the mainstream media and photographers and TV and radio people, which is, you know, something that didn't happen back in the day. I mean, I think journalists were you know, it was the era of Walter Cronkite, and the era of you know, three or four major television stations.
Mhm.
And now you go onto the floor, and you know, there's the local TV people, there's CNN, there's CBS, NBC, ABC. I mean, it's just, and then all the photographers and the radio people, and it's just a lot of people, and it's not very well organized compared to back in the day.
Yeah, I saw they even have like YouTube streamers up there. There's like I saw one guy real popular like on YouTube, and he was doing interviews and live streaming from the whole thing. Because did you cover the RNC as well this year?
I did cover the RNC.
And how different is how they organize their convention versus the DNC? Is it the same kind of shit show, or is it?
No, well, I thought the RNC was actually much more creative, much more open. If you're looking at the physical space, the RNC space in Milwaukee was all the delegates were all on the floor, which made it much, much easier. Where the DNC, there were delegates on the floor, but then there were delegates up all the way up to the, you know, up the aisles, which was pretty impossible to make photographs of. I mean, if you're walking up the aisle and you're looking down, they're on the left and there's people blocking, and so the RNC was much, much easier to photograph, and I would say more people friendly, which was really interesting. And I felt that their whole use of backdrops and so forth and messaging was much stronger than the DNC.
And were you on assignment, or is this like a personal project you're working on, or what were the pictures you were making that you were working on?
Yeah, it's a personal project. I mean, I think it's a historical moment in our history. And I did a book called Course of the Empire, which was my last book that Steidl published, that looks at 10 years leading up to Biden's election, and my perspective of what's happening with the American empire. And so, you know, having photographed that, having been at the RNC when Trump was first nominated in Cleveland, and then traveling and photographing, at the White House and on Capitol Hill and then across America. I just felt that it was important to photograph. And it's interesting. I definitely was more drawn to the RNC and had originally thought, I'm not going to go to the Democratic convention. It's going to be Biden. It's going to be boring, you know. And then as we got closer, it became clear that things were beginning to fall apart with Biden's running, and I thought it could be more interesting. Is it going to be a floor fight between delegates to select a nominee? And slowly, of course, Kamala Harris was kind of internally selected. And, there you have it. I mean, the thing to know from the standpoint of visual people is basically it's like a big TV studio, and it's free advertising, 4 days for each party, free advertising on television, and it's all set up and it's all controlled. And the thing is to figure out how you get beyond that control and what you can actually see that's not actually created for you to see. They pass out the signs. Were you on the floor?
No, I wasn't photographing. I was just, I'm not a photojournalist really. So I was
Yeah,
just, yeah, but I was obviously watching the coverage and
yeah.
I saw you on TV and whatnot.
Yeah, so I mean, they both parties they have signs that they want people to hold up, and they cue them and they pass them out down the aisles, and they say no, don't hold the sign up yet, and it's all made for television,
Yeah, there's like
basically.
the cheese heads from
Yeah, the
Wisconsin.
cheese heads, and yes, yeah.
So when you're going in to photograph these like conventions, like, do you have like a goal in mind of what you're looking to capture? Like, is it you're trying to focus on one area or people, or like how do you kind of approach photographing it? Because like you said, it's kind of a circus, and like,
Yeah.
do you have like a game plan going in, or how do you approach it
Well,
photographically?
the RNC was more interesting in the sense that it's, the cult of personality of Donald Trump. And so, people with their hats, their shoes, women with dresses with big pictures of Donald Trump on it. There's a whole fanaticism that, really is interesting from the standpoint of making photographs that were happening at the RNC. And, part of the problem is you're there for 4 days, and after a while you're seeing the same people over and over again, and
Hmm.
it's a limited space, and so you have to figure out how to kind of break through that. And for me, on the fourth day of photographing, it was kind of like I'm through. I mean, I've seen everything that I've wanted to see, and then how do you figure out to go beyond that? And at the RNC, it was much more easier. They had more stuff happening outside, where the DNC, the Democratic Convention, they had nothing going on outside. In Milwaukee, they had, a large area, two huge areas where delegates would hang out, and there was food and there were events, and they had all types of displays, and people were outside. And in fact, um, there was an area where they had kind of like almost like a food court,
Hmm.
selling food, but also selling T-shirts, and organizations were there, representing themselves. And there was a lemonade stand that, for whatever reason, didn't open, um, and they had a white vinyl sheet covering their stand. And I looked at that and I thought, wow, this is like a great backdrop to do a portrait series. And so for a couple hours, I just stood there, and as people walked by with their hats, their weird, regalia that they had on, I just pulled them aside, and I did portraits against this white backdrop. And it was a lot of fun and very, very interesting, capture them outside of the whole floor of the convention. There wasn't really the same sort of thing at the DNC. Um, the characters, if I call them characters, the players, I guess maybe is a better word. The players in the show at the DNC weren't as interesting.
And when
There
you say that, are you talking about like the speakers, like
Oh,
who?
the delegates.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, the delegates on the floor. They're not at the RNC. They're wearing all weird stuff. You know, I mean, you can only imagine. At the Democratic convention, they're much more straight, is what I would say. So not quite as interesting to photograph. And again, the physical layouts of both spaces were very different, and the DNC was much more difficult to photograph.
And as a journalist, like I guess probably more so the RNC, like how are you treated as a journalist? Because like with, I mean, their leader, the message they just keep sending is like a fake news media, uh, everything, all this. Like, do you find that people have like a bad attitude towards all the journalists, or kind of what's been your
Oh,
experience?
I didn't at the RNC. I did not find attitude against journalists. And you're right, having been to a number of Trump rallies and photographed where he turns to the, journalist and he says, "Enemy of the people," and everyone boos and gives them the finger. Uh, that didn't happen at all. In
Mm,
fact, at one point, Donald Trump praised the media. Um, and again, I think it's the sense of free advertising that it's out there, and they need the media. Um, I wouldn't. I'm trying to think. I wouldn't describe them as um, totally friendly, but not as unfriendly as the Democrats.
mm.
The Democrats I found very unfriendly. The Republicans, I mean, they asked you to move along. They had people minding you. Um, but as the DNC, they blocked aisles. You can't go here. You can't be here. As I said, they closed the floor on the last day for an hour and a half, 2 hours. Wouldn't admit media unless you were already on the floor, and if you left the floor, you couldn't get back in. And they just were harsh.
And what was it like your early? Because like I said, like I think your first convention was in Miami in 1972. Like, what
Yeah,
do you look back those like in the 70s, 80s, 90s? How different was it? Like,
I would say very different, more open,
yeah.
more willing to understand the role of journalism.
Mm,
And journalism, of course, the media has changed. I mean, if you think back to 1972, uh, most people were reading newspapers,
mhm.
uh, and most cities had numerous newspapers. I would imagine Boston had a couple newspapers. Um, and if you skip forward to 2024, you know, a lot of those newspapers have disappeared, or they have become very thin in their coverage. And I would imagine in 72, if we looked at the journalists who were at the convention, I would imagine that you would find a lot of newspapers in major cities sent journalists to cover the convention. And if you look at 2024, I would imagine that's not the case.
Yeah, it's basically like the
They're
news
depending on
shared.
Yeah,
Yeah,
they're depending on, the Associated Press or the
Getty.
New York Times wire service, or they're just not expending, they don't have the funds to send someone to cover, a photographer or a reporter to cover the convention. So that's really changed.
And as someone who spent their career working as a photojournalist, and I know you're a professor at UC Berkeley, like you said, the media like landscape has changed so much, and there's so many different new avenues to consume media. Um, what advice would you give to someone like what outlets do you trust? Are you reading everything? Because that is, I think, the thing. A lot of people there's so many internet, and with the advent of social media, and there's so many different outlets. Like, what advice would you give to someone consuming media in this day and era?
Well, I think you have to know that they have some sort of journalistic ethics in terms of their reporting and what they're doing. And um, everyone will point to CNN or the New York Times or the Washington Post or other publications. Oh yeah, they're leftists. They're not center in the middle. Um, I think you just have to listen to as much as you can from different sources and understand what they're standing and what their coverage is about. And in the case of the conventions, for example, that the message is being controlled by both political parties. So, you know, you have to understand that, they have certain speakers coming out, they're saying certain things, this is their message that they're trying to have us communicate. Um, if you're a visual journalist like I am, it's probably a little bit easier because it's all about, you know, seeing something and an emotion and so forth and so on. And then you have to figure out, what is the story that you're observing and how you're telling it and where that story is going to go.
Yeah, also I feel like the advent of like the 24-hour news cycle and cable TV, I feel like that probably changed a lot. Where I think it is even me myself, like I watch some channels and it's hard to decipher like what's news, and some stuff comes more off as like opinion pieces, you know?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, one of the things that the Democrats, I don't know if it was successful or not, is this whole creators area, which the New York Times ran a front story about a couple days ago, and so did other publications, NPR, looking at the fact that the Democrats, and to a lesser extent the Republicans, the Democrats had over 200 media creators who are young people. They're probably in their early 20s. They're untrained as journalists.
Mhm.
I mean, I've talked to a number of them, and I asked one woman, "Well, did she go to college?" Yes. What did you? Oh, I took theater. Okay, so there's absolutely no training in journalism, no understanding of what the ethics might be, fact checking. And these 200 people are credentialed by the DNC. They had their separate lounge that there was food at. Many of them were flown in. Excuse me. Many of them were flown in, um, and their airfare was paid for, their hotel was paid for. They had a separate entrance into the convention hall that was self-contained compared to the rest of us having to get credentialed and then going through various different entrances and being stuck on the floor. And then they had also a creators area in which the DNC, controlled by the Democratic Party, in which they brought politicians into that area so these creators could interview them. And most of these creators have no idea who these people are. They have
Yeah.
no idea who the senator is, what his politics is, who this congressperson is. And in fact, there's been all this conversation about Kamala not doing interviews to the mainstream media, but she did interviews with the creators. So they're trying to reach this demographic, where someone who's a creator has, 250,000, a million people listening to their podcasts, TikTok, X, whatever platform they're on, and they're trying to reach that audience, and they are bypassing the mainstream media, which I find to be fascinating.
Yeah, I talk about this with my fellow freelance photographer friends all the time, and I think with the advent of like social media, a lot of brands, I don't know that they really care about quality as much anymore. It's just really like how much reach do you have, how many people can reach, and it's just a lot of that, which is just kind of like I don't know. It's sad to see because for me, I want people that know what they're talking about, or like I want the news to be more informed than me, and because that's their job. Because a daily person is just trying to make a living, get through the day, pay their bills, and you want to rely on the journalists who that's their job all day, and they know all the details, and that's why you go to them because they're the experts.
Absolutely, and that's the problem with this whole creator thing. These people are not experts at all. They are people showing fashion. There's a guy who had multiple millions of followers who does dance. That's what he does on his
Hmm.
channel. And they brought him in to
Hmm.
dance. And I think the idea that he could reach all his followers dancing at the DNC somehow makes his audience maybe feel more comfortable voting for the party,
Yeah.
but they have no idea
I,
who they're voting for or what it's about or what the
Or
issue
I see, I'd love to
is.
see the analytic of like what how many of those people are actually showing up to vote. Like that's the main like
Yes.
that's what
Yeah.
I'd love to know. But yeah, it's crazy times. But
It is
uh
crazy times. And my colleagues and I were talking about it. It's kind of like 1984, disinformation, and your, as you said, you trust people who are telling the story, who are in it, who know the candidates, who know how they behave, and they're trying to bypass that by going to people who know nothing, but
mhm,
yet who are so excited to be there and be credentialed, right, and be treated to a special lounge and have access to all these politicians and a separate area. And it's scary as a journalist, as someone who's taught in journalism school and worked with amazing journalists for decades. It's scary. It's really scary.
yeah, once you start trying to roll out the red carpet and serving caviar and champagne, it's like they're basically just trying to buy their message, which is like
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's fucked.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess to go back, Ken, like where do you grow up and how do you kind of discover photography?
Yeah, so I was born in the Bronx, and when I was 3 years old, my family moved out to the new suburbia on Long Island, which had been potato fields. Um, and I dabbled in photography in high school, but I wouldn't, I was 17, 18 years old, and I had no sense of the world or what I should be photographing.
Mhm.
Um, when I went off to college in 1969 to Ohio University, um, I threw myself into the anti-war movement and I became an organizer on our campus against the war in Vietnam. Most of your listeners probably know if you didn't go to college, you could be drafted, and if you were in college, you were draft deferred.
Mhm.
And Vietnam War was, I mean, thousands and thousands of young kids were being killed, and so it was also a time in which there were no women's studies programs. There were no ethnic studies or Black study programs. So it was a time of great turmoil. You could be, it's hard to believe, if you had a joint, you could be thrown in jail for 10 years. Um, and if had long hair, you could be beat up. And of course, there's the whole music scene that was exploding that our parents didn't understand. So it was a really tumultuous time. I had done a little bit of photography in high school. My dad was an amateur photographer, so I was around him doing 16 millimeter film and taking still photographs, slides. Um, and I began to see things around me that needed to be shown, and I sent off to TM Chan in Hong Kong. This was before you could go to B&H Photo. There was no internet. You sent a money order.
There's a catalog. There's a catalog you had
Yeah,
to order from
right, a
the
catalog. It was very mysterious. You got a money order. You sent it off to Hong Kong.
Hope it shows up.
Hope it shows up. And I want to say a couple weeks later, a box came with a Pentax K1000, and the Pentax K1000 label was blacked over because I guess it was off market, gray market camera. It had a 50 millimeter lens, and I began to photograph the world around me. So I'm 18 years old, and there's protests, and I'm in it. The college I'm in is in Southeast Ohio, which is kind of on the edge of Appalachia. And then really the moment for me was in 1970, um, April of 1970, um, when Nixon and Kissinger started secretly bombing Cambodia. And people on the campuses had been organizing against the war. And of course, the secret of the bombing was very short lived. And it came out that we were bombing a neutral country, and the campuses exploded. And the explosion of the campuses was not just the Vietnam War. I think it was the repression of not wanting to have women's studies, Black studies. Remember, the Black Panther Party was very big. Other minority organizations had organized the United Farm Workers. Um, and in August 29th, in April 29th, 1970, Ohio State University, which was north of where I was going to school, exploded at night, and there were riots because of the administration not wanting to deal with these issues that students were trying to change. And the National Guard was called out, and this was Governor Rhodes, was a conservative Republican, called out the National Guard to put down the student protests. And I decided I should hitchhike up to Columbus to photograph. So I
Wow.
hitchhiked up to Columbus with my camera, my Pentax with a 50 millimeter lens, a gas mask, my press pass that I had gotten from the school newspaper, the Ohio University Post. And I arrived, and there's the National Guard on the college green. It was a huge college green in Columbus, Ohio. And the National Guard's out there with fixed bayonets, and they're trying to move the students back and forth, and the students go around them, and they're shooting off tear gas. And I photograph. With a 50 mm lens, you have to be pretty close.
Mm.
Handheld light meter,
All
Lunapro
right.
light meter,
Yeah.
film, Tri-X. Um, and as I'm photographing, all of a sudden I feel these hands behind me grab me, you're under arrest, and
Yeah.
they zip tie me and they move me to a police wagon with many other people. I think I want to say about 300 people were arrested during that protest.
Wow.
Uh, I'm taken to jail. I'm fingerprinted and a mugshot's made. And then when I get out of the jail the next day, they give me a brown bag, and in the brown bag is my camera and my film that I had photographed. I hitchhiked back to Athens. I developed the film. I make some 8x10 prints, and I send it off to Liberation News Service. So Liberation News Service at that time was the kind of Associated Press of underground newspapers. So in 1970, there were about 650 underground newspapers all across America. So almost every, the Old Mole in Boston, for example, was the big newspaper in Boston.
When we say
Uh,
underground, like where were they distributed to? Is this kind of
Campuses sold on street corners. They had, the Berkeley Barb in Berkeley had a circulation of over 50,000
wow.
copies every week. So this was our like media, right? Because the mainstream media saw us as kind of dirty hippies. Our music was, horrible. Um, you know, Smoking marijuana was against the law. You're against, I mean, we were just, I mean, hundreds of millions of people were kind of outsiders during this era. So the underground newspapers kind of represented our voices. So I sent it off to Liberation News Service, and a couple days after the pictures got there, the students were killed at Kent State University on May 4th. So my pictures representing what had happened in Columbus then were distributed by LNS, and the pictures were published all over the world.
And that was the first thing you ever had published?
I mean, that wide,
Yeah, yeah.
yes. And all of a sudden your pictures are in Africa and Cuba and Europe and underground newspapers. I know the Old Mole, for example, in Boston used one or two of my pictures. Um, and when you're 19 years old and you see what you've witnessed and what you've photographed um, appear all over the world, you kind of realize, wow, this photography, you could really have a voice. You could see the things that you are concerned about, the things that you have been fighting and pressing for, the issues around race, poverty, inclusion, the war, the culture, all these things that I kind of was interested in and had been photographing. Um, you could have a voice.
Because
And that was kind of where I decided I'm going to be a photographer. And, I guess I was pretty naive. I didn't think like, how am I going to get a job? I mean, it was an era where things were, gas was 29 cents a gallon. I mean, God even knows what minimum wage was, but you could have, a lifestyle that you didn't need that much money to
yeah.
be able to go out there and do this sort of stuff. And that's where I began to just follow my nose. I didn't have any idea of that I was doing a project. I was just photographing.
Have you always been, because looking at your work and like, have you always just been like kind of fearless and like approaching people and communicating with people? Like, even like the post you made on LinkedIn where it's like you got a security guy in your face and it's just like, or going to that, like, have you always just been like this kind of
I don't know
fearless?
if fearless is the right word. I believe in democracy. I believe in the free press. I believe in people having their voices and not being stifled. And my experience with the projects I've worked on and the communities I've photographed are usually communities in which they're unseen. And so when you show up, you know, um, people are happy to talk to you because no one cares about them.
Hmm.
The New York Times is not doing reporting on Mississippi, and they're not going into the communities and looking what's happening to the communities. I mean, they're not even reporting on, the issues in the Bronx or, those communities in the New York region that have no voice. And so as a photographer, when you go into those communities and you say, I'm here to listen and I'm here to try to tell your story, people are incredibly open.
And
And
once,
I don't
yeah,
take no for an answer.
it shows. And the one thing, like you kind of mentioned with photojournalism, there's a lot of ethics and how you approach it, and you'll often hear the term like parachute journalism. Like when you're going to like a different country or culture and you're documenting, like how do you approach that? And is there any scenario that you community that you won't enter, or like how do you approach this ethics of photojournalism and what you're covering?
So almost all my work is in the United States. And I think from the beginning of my career as a young photographer, I really looked at, um, why aren't we looking at our own backyard? We're always looking at everyone else's backyard, and we're always telling other countries and other people how they should behave based on, our attitude. But we are not looking at our own backyard. We're not looking at the things that need to be seen. And, you know, um, I admire a lot of the photographers who have traveled all over the world and have told these stories of other places. In some sense, it's much harder to photograph in your backyard in your own country. And so my whole career has really been spent on looking at America and looking at the issues that I think are unseen. Um, and that, I mean, it's harder and it's easier. I mean, it's easier because you speak the language and you understand on some level the customs. Um, and it's harder because people have been ignored and they often don't trust the media. And I often on the many in-depth projects. So my projects are not just parachuting in. So when
Mhm.
I'm doing a project like Delta Time, my book on rural Mississippi, I spent 4.5 years doing that. Or Coal Hollow, my book on rural West Virginia, I spent almost 4 years on that. And so I'm spending, um, you know, a good amount of time going to these communities and reaching out to people in the community. There's a lot of nonprofit NGO organizations that I connect with and talk to them and try to understand what the story is. Um, and it's very different than when you just kind of drop in and you have, what we call a fixer working with you, and that person's navigating the culture in a foreign country, and you don't necessarily understand it, or you have preconceptions of what that culture is about, but you're not really soaking it in. My way of working is pretty different.
In depth. And what advice would you give to someone that's interested in pursuing photojournalism and wants to tell stories? Like when you're starting a project and you have a story in mind, like what does that look like? Is it how are you doing the outreach? How do you approach it? And like what advice would you give someone that wants to do project-based work?
Well, I always like to say, have a good job.
Yeah, yeah.
The problem is it's very hard to, you immerse yourself and then you get completely frustrated because no one wants the story. I mean, I remember doing a story back in the late 70s on agricultural workers, and one of my focuses that I was really interested in was child labor. And I every time I would go out to photograph agricultural workers, and I traveled all over the country, New Jersey, Florida, Washington, Oregon, California, Arizona, Ohio. Um, I would look for child labor and I'd photograph it. And I thought, wow, here we are. This was the late 70s, early 80s. Here we are. Children are still working in the fields with their parents because they're not getting paid enough, the adults, and they need their children to work with them. I thought, wow, this is a great story. I went to Life magazine, which was still publishing at that time, and I went to Mother Jones. So you have two different spectrums, political, you have the left and the right, and both of them were kind of like, oh yeah, everyone knows about this. And so I think you have to really believe in the story you're telling to start with, and you need to understand that getting that message out into the world is going to be somewhat difficult. And I worked as a freelance photographer. I taught part-time in many different colleges. So I think, you can't, even though you have a really great story, you can't depend on, I'm going to sell this to whomever, whatever media organizations out there. And I think you have to realize, or at least I have, that bodies of work that you have created over time will go out into the world. And so, I've dived into these stories, many of which have been published in books, 12 books, um, some of which have not yet been published. So I'm actually going back to early work that I did, that no one was interested in. I did when I first moved to California in 1973. In 1974 and 1975, I worked in West Oakland, which was a largely Black community that had been cut off from the main city by a freeway that had bypassed through the middle of the community. And I worked in the community, and I did a wonderful body of work in the 70s. And of course, people saw the work and they said, who cares about Black people? And it was like, well, I do, and I'm interested in this story. And it just sat there. Literally, it sat there. And I would say in the last 2 years, I kind of went back into the archive, went back into looking at the contact sheets, and began to edit and, put together a large body of work from those photographs, hoping that I'll do a contemporary book of that era. And of course, the wonderful thing about photography, it's like a time machine, which a lot of photographers don't realize, that you can't go back. You can't go back 50 years and photograph. And I remember talking to some of my students after looking at some photographs of Walker Evans, and they said, "Wow, Walker Evans was really lucky. Look at those old cars he photographed." And I'm like, "No, those are not old cars. When Walker Evans photographed, those were the cars. Those were the
Those are
contemporary
new cars.
cars.
Those are new cars.
Those are new cars. They're old cars to you." And I think a lot of young photographers don't understand that the landscape visually changes. I mean, I think about myself when I was 18, thinking that everyone was going to be wearing bell bottoms the rest of their lives or have long hair. And of course, that has all changed. And so fashion changes, buildings changes, the demographics of a city change, cars change. And so in doing a project, you have to realize that you are witnessing and recording an important part of history that may at the time people look at and say, who cares? But have faith in what you're doing and have faith in the time that you're putting into a story.
Yeah, and it shows with your work. Like obviously you want to get published, you want to do books and all that, but it comes from a pure place of like you want to tell these stories. And I would imagine it's more about like self-satisfaction and like doing these projects for your own putting the stories out there. Not it's not driven by like publication or making money or anything like that. It's this pure storytelling, right?
Yeah, it's storytelling and the passion of observing my country, which, you know, has ups and downs and good times and bad times and frustrating times. And, that's how I see myself.
Yeah.
And
And
going back to the convention is part of this history. I don't know what I'm going to do with it, but I feel like I bring a unique voice um, to it, and I did it, and yeah, some of it's posted on my Instagram page, and some of it's on Facebook, and the rest is being developed as we speak by
yeah,
me. Darkroom.
I was gonna ask you about that. Like, is film always been your preferred medium? And like, I guess with the convention stuff, what made you want to use the Mamiya 6 for that stuff?
So I've been using the Mamiya 6 for decades. My early work, like Delta Time and my farm worker photographs, were shot with a Hasselblad, and you have to use a tripod or a monopod. It's very heavy. It's not a camera that it's not a well-made field camera. It's really a studio camera. At a certain point, I kind of got frustrated with um, problems I had with the camera in photographing and try to figure out, well, what would be a good medium format camera. And the Mamiya seemed like it was perfect, like a big Leica. I like the square format. Some people hate the square format. It's just a different way of seeing and composing, and it was a challenge, coming from as a young photographer doing 35 millimeter. Um,
Yeah, no, it's good. I
and I like
love.
film.
Yeah.
I mean, I like to think, for example, work that I did, my book, Midnight La Frontera, the book
Yeah.
that PW published, my night photographs along the border, which was done from 83 to 87. I like to think, if I had shot that digitally, if digital was available at that time, would those files still be there?
Well, yeah, I was
This is the
excited to
problem
talk to
with
you.
digital,
I was
is it gonna,
Yeah, I was excited to talk about that project because yeah, the project Midnight La Frontera, it's about a story about people jumping the border from I think like Tijuana into San Diego, and it's like
yes,
all at night, shot on Hasselblad, black and white with flash. Like,
yes.
what do you remember about making that work? Because you're in the middle of the night, these people are going through one of like most like the difficult times of their life. It's an insane situation to be in, and like you're there with like flash popping off. Like, what was their reaction to you showing up? Because like middle of the night, flash is going off. Like, what do you?
Yeah, so I mean, the challenges were, first of all, most photographers in that era did not go out at night because we did not have digital cameras. We did not have autofocus. We did not have, um, any of the tools you could go out to today with your camera and photograph. So I'm going out literally, and the other part is for those reasons, most photographers didn't go out at night to tell the story. They photographed up into dusk. But most of what happens, and most of the people who are coming through are not coming through at 5 o'clock or as dusk happens. They're waiting till it's darkness, because it's a pretty serious moment for them trying to get into the United States. Um, so one was the ability that there weren't that many photographers that were interested in the story. So the Border Patrol was not a problem traveling with them. And I would, unlike today, when you're probably traveling with a public information officer who is going to drive you and tell you what you can see and what you can't see. I went out with individual Border Patrol agents who were working in the field, and I would go out from 4 in the afternoon until 7 in the morning, and there'd be a shift change. And so when the shift change happened, I would go with another agent until 7 in the morning when the sun came up. Um, you couldn't see. I mean, it's pitch black, so you couldn't focus if you wanted to. So you simply, or I simply pre-focus, knowing that between 8 feet and 15 feet with the flash on the camera, the photograph would be sharp. You couldn't see through the viewfinder because it's so dark.
Yeah.
I mean, you can see with your eyes normalized to the darkness, but looking through the viewfinder just wasn't even going to happen. And so, really, you looked through the camera without looking through the camera.
And
Uh,
was flash a part of your workflow much back then prior to that
oh,
project?
absolutely not.
Yeah.
Never. Rarely, I should say. At that time, probably never using flash. Always available light. So it was a whole new experience, photographing. And I would just be next to that Border Patrol agent as they apprehended people, or as he said, okay, let's hide behind this bush because this is where people will come. And when we see them, I'm going to jump up and apprehend them, and you can make a photograph. Um, the reaction of the people, I think I'm the least important part of what's happened to them.
Hmm.
They've just been apprehended. They're not really worrying about a flash going off and being photographed. Um, and so, I spent from 83 to 87 on and off doing that project. And again, the project talks to what we were discussing earlier about work being seen and unseen. So the border work was part of a bigger project. So I did the border work and I showed it to a lot of people at the night work, and people really were like fascinated with it. Wow, this is really amazing. But they didn't really get the story. The story that people were leaving Mexico at that time. People were like, oh yeah, they're coming, their life's shit in Mexico and they're coming here. And there was no sense that there was a very deep culture in Mexico, that they were being forced to leave because of the poverty that was happening in that era. And then there was no sense of where people ended up. There was just a sense that there was this, as a newspaper in San Diego reported, a brown invasion that was happening in that era. So for me, it was a bigger story. And so I had started at the border, and then these comments that I heard from people, I realized, well, I need to go into Mexico and photograph in Mexico and show the villages and communities in which people were coming. And I did two trips, um, one to Michoacan, the state of Michoacan, and the other to the state of Oaxaca. And then I realized, well, I have the border, I have Mexico, I need to do the north. And then I spent time photographing in the north in San Diego, Fresno, places where downtown Los Angeles, places where these undocumented people were coming, and kind of living in situations that were, not that good. The book that came out was To the Promised Land that Aperture published in 1988. And it only had a small number of the night pictures. And then in 2016, when Donald Trump started talking about the border as he was beginning his campaign to, become the candidate for the Republicans, and just the vitriol, he talked about undocumented people in Mexico, they're rapists, they're criminals, they're mentally ill, all this stuff. I thought this is going to be a big story again. I should go back at into that work. And because it's negatives and contact sheets, very easy to find.
Mhm.
I pulled out, all the contact sheets, hundreds and hundreds of rolls of film that I had photographed at night. And I realized, wow, there are all these pictures that I made in that era in the 80s that for whatever reason, I just kind of didn't print,
Mm.
didn't select. And so I started printing that work and ended up with this incredible, powerful work of the night photographs, which no one else had. And that's when I did work with Paul Sheik at TBW, and we did Midnight La Frontera, which is a really incredible designed and powerful book of the night photographs.
Yeah, it's a beautiful book on your site, and I was looking at it. And do you think it would even be possible? Because I mean, people are obviously still crossing the border now. Would it even be possible in this day and age to make that type of work, you think?
No,
Yeah, just because the
not
border.
not in the way that, I mean, really, I was unhampered. Not once did any of the agents say, "Don't take this picture," or "We can't go here." In fact, it was the opposite. They wanted to show me things that no one else saw,
Mm,
which, like, let's go here, let's go there. We're going to wait here. I mean, they knew all these things, and I just sat in the Ram Charger, Border Patrol Ram Charger, and we drove around, and et cetera, et cetera, as people were apprehended.
yeah, I was gonna ask you about that. Like nowadays, everyone has a camera in their pocket, and then with the advent of digital cameras, everyone has digital cameras. Like, how has that changed being a photojournalist? Because do you feel like nowadays people react differently to cameras than back in the day when you first started?
Yes,
Yeah,
everyone wants to curate their own lives.
yeah,
I find it really annoying.
yeah,
You go to an event and they don't want their picture taken because they're going to do it themselves.
yeah.
And and the other thing that I find even more annoying is in the majority of time that I photographed, people were very focused on their own world. And now, for example, even at the conventions, you try to take a picture, everyone has their cell phones held up high.
Yeah.
And I think back to my pictures of the Vietnam War protests, and everyone has their peace finger up or their power fist up. Today, you go to a protest and everyone has their cell phone up. They're filming it. Who knows where it's going? They're just, I don't know. Somehow they feel they can't be there unless they film
Yeah,
it.
I never, it's like people that go to concerts and I'm
Oh my
like,
God, right?
what are you gonna do? I want to know what those people do with that audio because it's like audio on your iPhone of a concert. It just sounds like, what are we doing?
Right? You're not sitting there listening to the concert. You're blocking someone's view and who's sitting behind you.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I guess yeah. So how it's just a different approach as a photojournalist
Different
now.
approach. And
Yeah,
it's a very annoying.
yeah,
And
and
as I said, people want to curate their own lives. They don't want to be curated by you, which, they have no sense that they might be part of a movement, a part of history that needs to be recorded and seen. And in 50 years, people want to see this and understand what that world was about.
as someone who, as well, you're a photojournalist, but then you also teach photojournalists. Is being a photojournalist still a viable career path? And like, what do you teach your students?
Good
Because
question.
Yeah.
A colleague and I were discussing this the other day, and he says, I feel very guilty teaching journalism because where's people going to go? But in our program at UC Berkeley, in the graduate school, people end up getting jobs.
Hmm.
I mean, photography is no longer just photography. I mean, in my era, you just were a photographer.
Yeah.
Now photographers need to know video. They need to know how to write. They need to maybe do some audio. It's much more multi-dimensional than it was when I was doing it, or when I'm still doing it. I'm just making photographs.
Hmm.
I'm not thinking about sound. I'm not filming. Uh, so our program is pretty well integrated. So photographers who would be coming in would be learning these other skills. And I think, photographers working with publications, whether they're mainstream printed publications or whether they're online, um, they need to have more skills. But in my era, it wasn't so easy. You know, the day rate hadn't changed. Of course, there were the main, there was Life magazine and Look and Saturday Evening Post had gone out of business. The big picture magazines were no longer there. Yeah, Time, Newsweek, and U.S. News Report were the big, uh, you know, weekly publications. Um, but still, getting assignments, getting freelance assignments, you had to really look outside that media world and maybe work. I did a lot of work with nonprofits, for example, hospitals or social service agencies. Um, and yeah, it's not easy. But
And
if you have a passion for it,
yeah.
you'll find a way, is what
No,
I like.
I'm like you
Oh,
can't. I can't not do it. I was
right,
like,
that's the answer.
you know what I mean? But I'm like, I'm still trying to give a thread of hope to people listening that want to pursue a career because it's like newspapers don't exist the way they do because it seems like now to actually be a photojournalist and be able to eat, it seems like you basically your options are, and tell me if I'm wrong, it's like work for Getty, pray that you can maybe get a contract job at like the Times or like one of these like online publications. But other than that, it's just I don't know. It's
Yes, I'm absolutely
yeah,
yes.
yeah.
So you have to have the passion. You have to feel like this is what I have to do. I have no choice. It's kind of like, I guess, actors and actresses, like you go to LA and you're in a restaurant, what do you do? I'm in the entertainment business, but they're a waiter or a waitress, right? Or I mean, but they have a passion and they're trying to figure out a way to support that passion. And I did all types of stuff. I mean, when I first moved to California in '73, um, I got a job in an underpants warehouse, packing underpants. I did not dare tell them that I had gone to college because they would not have hired me.
Yeah.
That, that was the beginning of my kind of career of earning some money. And then I worked doing layout and paste up at a Shopper, the little newspaper that has grocery ads in it.
Yeah.
That was great because it was, I think, one day and two nights. And that gave me time to freelance and go out and do my own photography. And so I think if there's a passion, if there's a real passion um, in your audience
Hmm.
who are listening, they're going to find a way to do it. And it has never been easy,
No.
never been easy. And
No.
I've been lucky to fall into this job at Berkeley where I've been for a very long time.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I think I had someone like early on when I got into photography and they gave me a piece of advice I never forgot. They're like, if you can just find a way to stick around, like opportunities will happen and you can grow slowly. And I think like you ain't gonna get rich being a photographer for the most part. It doesn't exist. But I think if you have a passion for photography and you can just keep making work and progress. Because even at this point in your career, like everything you've accomplished, do you feel like you're still like learning as a photographer and trying to grow and be sharper and like be how you approach your photography?
Yes, absolutely. Always learning. I mean, one of the great things about teaching is you get to see some great student photographers and you get to see what they're doing. And I wouldn't say I'm competing against them, but their lust for making a great photograph and really trying to tell a story really is inspiring to me as a teacher.
Yeah,
And I mean, I'm still working as a photographer. There's a lot of teachers who have kind of just teach
yeah.
and and their photography life is gone.
I always hated that as when I went to RIT. Loved RIT, great photography school. Yeah, and there were those professors who just didn't shoot anymore. And it just kind of
Right.
like it bummed me out. But the ones that still shot, like I just had lunch with my old professor, Dennis Deffabaugh. He was a professor at RIT for years and he just retired, but he's still shooting. And I was like, that's the stuff that gets me excited, you know?
Yeah, and that's important, I think, in an educational environment, that the people you are learning from or mentoring, and really you're part, you're a teacher, but you're also a mentor. And I stay in touch with a lot of my students, ex-students who are working. In fact, um, when I went to both Milwaukee and Chicago to photograph two of my students, ex-students, I bunked with, and they're working and they're trying to figure it out.
Yeah.
And that's the passion of telling the story. And I think, as you said, Alex, it's like a pyramid. Everyone starts at the bottom, and slowly over time, people get worn out, they give up, they can't make a living, and those who stay with it, you know, um, have a more and more powerful voice,
Mm.
have more opportunities because there's fewer of us.
Yeah, definitely.
I mean,
Um,
I hung out a lot with Bruce Gilden.
oh wow. Oh man.
I know well from God, decades and decades ago when we were young photographers. And Bruce is, I think he's 78, I want to say. And there he was on the floor photographing. I'm 73, and that we're like the old timers.
He was Gildan always this piss and vinegar. Like I've never met him, but just
Always,
watching
always.
interviews, yeah, this like
Yes,
he
always.
got. I remember watching this video on YouTube where he's just on the street in New York and this got a flash like right in someone's face, and someone obviously gets mad. He's like, "Fuck you! This street the public street." Like,
That's Bruce. That's Bruce. Absolutely.
yeah. Who are your did you have any like photographers that inspired you early on, or like who are your
Yeah, I
photographers?
mean, I would say the canon, I mean, just the canon: Jacob Riis, Lewis Hine, Dorothea Lange, Gene
Yeah,
Smith, Paul
yeah.
Strand, Helen Levitt, Marion Post Walcott. I mean, um, I just dug deep into the history of photography. I mean, in the old days, in my early days, you could go into the bookstore, and they actually had photo books in the bookstore.
Hmm.
Not as many as today. I mean, today they're everywhere, but in those days there were fewer. And I remember, for example, when East 100th Street first came out, and Larry Clark's Tulsa first came out, and I remember searching to see if I could find the decisive moment.
Yeah.
And someone told me about this book called The Americans by Robert Frank, and it's discovery. And you discover this work that's done, and you're inspired by them, and you learn from them. And I would sit. People say, well, how did you learn to sequence photographs? Well, I would sit with these books, and I would flip through them, and I would look at them, and why do they have this order, and what are they trying to say, and why is this a good photograph? And um, I took one photo class in college, and
Wow.
that was
What was your major in college?
general studies. You could do a general studies degree.
Okay. That's yeah, yes, you get rich off that. You know.
Yeah. Oh, like, what's your degree? General studies. What's that?
Yeah, what's that? Yeah. That's amazing. Um, one body of work I was interested in talking about, you documented the LAPD, the police department. I was curious, like,
Yes.
was that an assignment, a personal work? Because like those some people got to go to your website, like they are like some of the situations you were in was wild.
Yeah, so the LAPD was an assignment. At that point, I was with a photo agency called JB Pictures in New York, run by Jocelyn Benzekian, who's a really
Yeah,
wonderful and very important photo editor.
yeah.
And this was shortly after Rodney King had happened, and the riots. And so they hired Newsweek hired me and another photographer. I mean, this was the era, right? They hired a photographer to do color, and they hired a photographer to do black and white, 35 millimeter. And I was the black and white photographer. And we did a ride along with the LAPD, the two different areas. One of them was the Ramparts Division, which later had a big scandal explode there. Um, and it was really funny. I remember the first day, and I talk about it a lot in classes. The first day we showed up, and we met the officers we were going to go out with, and they said, here we are, two photographers, and they say, we want to give you guys bulletproof vests. And I said, oh, I brought my own. And the other photographer said, I don't need a bulletproof vest. And they said, no, we're going out in the streets. You should have a bulletproof vest. And he says, no, no, I don't need one. And they're like, okay. And then we split up. We each went out with different officers. And early the next day, I want to say 4 in the morning or 5 in the morning, we met back at the precinct. And the other photographer who was shooting color said to me, what did you do? All I did was spend all day in a donut shop. They didn't let me see anything. And I said, no, we were in chases, dead people, busting gangs. He said, really? And, it was partly, because, I presented myself to the police officers. I understand this is a dangerous job. I came prepared.
Yeah.
I understand. And his attitude was, oh yeah, whatever, nothing's
Yeah,
gonna happen.
those cops don't want to be the guy like, hey, this journalist got shot and he wasn't wearing
Yes,
they don't want to take that heat. So they're like, hey,
absolutely. No.
exactly.
And then, partly as a photographer, you always need to push your boundaries. They tell you you can't do this or you can't do that, and then you just push the boundaries and see how far you can go. And I remember on that assignment as well, we went into the meeting where all the officers, the cops show up before they go out into the field, and they're sitting in a room, and the sergeant's in front, just like on TV.
Mhm.
And I got up on a desk and started photographing. And I remember after we went out, we're leaving to go with the officers we're going to be riding with for the ride along. The other photographer said, "Oh my God, I can't believe you got up on the desk." And I said, "Yeah, well, the worst thing that could happen is they'd come up to me and say, 'What the hell are you doing? Get off the desk.'"
Yeah,
And I
yeah,
was like, "Yeah, I'm really sorry. I didn't know."
yeah.
So, one of the things about being a photographer is pushing the limits and um, always being ready to say, "I'm sorry." But if you just stay with what they tell you to do, you may not get the pictures that you want to get.
Yeah, what they say, what's the saying? Like it's easier to ask for forgiveness later than, ask
Yes,
for
absolutely.
yeah, that work. The picture that's stuck in my mind, you're like in the police car and the cop has his gun like below the window pointing
Right,
at
hiding the gun, ready to shoot.
like were you like in that because how long did you work on those photos? Is it just like a couple days or something like on assignment
I
basis?
think I was with them for 3 days.
Like did it kind of were you surprised of like what you saw? Because like some of the photos are very jarring and it's like what do you remember about like your experience?
Yeah, yes. That scene where, he says, "I'm going to pull over these gangbangers," and who knows if they're gangbangers or not, right?
Yeah.
Um, but this could go bad. And he pulls his gun out, and as you say, he's looking at them in their car, and he has the gun sitting below the window, and I'm next to him, and it's like, yeah, something could happen.
Yeah.
Didn't, but those moments are the moments as a photographer you're looking for.
And it is interesting, like you're talking about revisiting some of this older work and everything that's happening now in the world. Is there any hope for the future? Is it this history is doomed to repeat itself? Like you've seen a lot. Like, what do you think?
Well, yeah, Course of the Empire is my kind of um, tome to what I see as kind of the falling apart of the American empire, and
Mhm.
that we are not, we are ignoring our backyard. That, I don't know how it is in Boston, but in the Bay Area, the homeless situation is horrific.
Yep.
And the cost of living here is horrific. I could never move here now as a young photographer because the cost of renting a place and the wages, and I mean it's really hard to watch. Um, I'm my wife would tell you I am a very hopeful person.
Yeah.
You know, half full, half empty. I'm half full.
That's good, Ken. That's
I
good. As
kind
much
of
as you see, man, that's amazing that you are. Like,
you know I I don't know why I still believe in this country and what's possible after all the things I've seen.
yeah, because I think that's the
I've seen
thing,
a
man.
lot.
You're not a quitter. Like that's what it is. Like as hard as times get being a freelance photographer or whatever's going on in the world, like all you can do is go forward. That's
All you
what
can
I
do is
tell
go
my
forward.
Yeah.
And, and I think about all these photographers that photographed in their eras, Jacob Riis, How the Other Half Lives, Alexander Gardner during the Civil War, Dorothea Lange, the Great Depression. I mean, what they recorded and their stories are so important for us. And we are just on this planet for a very short time. And as photographers, if you really embrace being a photographer, you really want to witness your time and record it. And it's both in the moment, but I understand it's also, hopefully in 100 years, people will look back at some of these pictures and say, wow, look at what happened then,
Yeah.
what the world was about. And that is powerful.
Definitely. And I guess to wrap up, like what keeps you doing this? I guess we've kind of already talked about it, but what keeps you excited about photography? What is it you love about photography, and like what anything you're hoping to do moving forward?
I love the process. I love the creative aspect of trying to make an interesting photograph out of something that's just, you know, move taking the moving world and stopping it into a composition that when people look at, they kind of get what it is I'm seeing and recording. I mean, that to me is really important. Um, Telling stories. I mean, one of the great things about being a photographer is you have to be there. You could be a reporter writing or a writer, and you could call on the phone and you could get the story over the phone. But as a photographer, you have to be on the ground. When
Right.
that fire's happening, you have to be on the ground. You can't call up 2 days later and ask, an eyewitness who was there tell the story. So, you know, the places I've been and the things I've seen, my God, just from death row to rural Mississippi to the border at night to the conventions to all these incredible moments that I've stood in and witnessed is by itself a reward of doing this work.
Awesome. Well, Ken, real honor to talk to you. I'm glad I discovered your work, and really appreciate the time, and really
My
look
pleasure.
forward to seeing what you photograph next.